Welcome to the first of a series of lectures on German history. Today we're going to focus on the Weimar Republic, more especially the period known as the Years of Crisis, 1918 to 1923. So what was the situation in 1918? Well, Germany at that time was still an autocracy, although it had a veneer of democracy in that it had a parliament, the Reichstag, and a chancellor, prime minister. It was appointed by the Kaiser or the emperor himself. Elections did take place, but again, it didn't necessarily mean that just because you won an election that your party would make up the government. The war was a profound shock to the German people, especially when they realised they were losing it, or when they did actually lose it. There were certain indicators that things weren't going as well as has been thought. From about 1916, the German population was becoming increasingly war-weary. There were mounting casualties, there was a fall in living standards, increased inflation, and food and fuel shortages due to the British blockade of the ports led to a growing labour unrest. So much so there were mass strikes in January 1918 throughout both Germany and Austria-Hungary. The war in 1918 actually wasn't going too bad from about the spring through to about the summer, and the German push onto Paris seemed to be working. Unfortunately for the Germans, the American soldiers were coming through more and more and were able to halt this advance and push them back. The German High Command then realised that this could be a humiliating defeat, especially if the Allies would be able to push right onto German soil and on towards Berlin. So rather than have that happen, they felt that they would be dealt more leniently with a parliamentary government, and so abandoned their resistance to domestic reform. So on the 3rd of October 1918, Prince Max von Baden was installed as Chancellor by the German military command, and a variety of reforms of the constitution were announced. In Prussia, which was a large chunk of Germany at that time, the three-class franchise, so in other words, the different classes, the higher classes would have more say, more power, more votes than the others, was abolished. The Kaiser's powers over the army and the appointments were severely curtailed, and the Chancellor and the government were made accountable directly to the Reichstag, not the Kaiser. This was a revolution of sorts, and fairly similar to the revolution of February 1917 in Russia. Having said that, this was different in many ways because this was a revolution from above, i.e. the people instigating the revolution were the people already in power. A major revolution does take place though in November, only through basically almost a week. On the 3rd of November 1918, sailors on the naval base of Kiel mutiny. The unrest spreads very rapidly through to Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, Bremen, and then on to Berlin. Dock workers and soldiers join the mutineers and form Soviets. On the 6th of November, Workers' and Soldiers' Councils are established, or Soviets, and on the 7th and 8th of November, there's a revolution in Munich and a socialist republic is declared. The Wittelsbach dynasty is deposed and a republic proclaimed. On the 9th of November, the abdication of the Kaiser is announced. Von Baden resigns, and Friedrich Ebert, the socialists' leader, becomes Chancellor. The republic is hastily declared by Philipp Scheidemann. It had to be very hastily declared, but because what became the Communist Party were planning to declare further down the road, and if that happened, then people were frightened this might lead to a Soviet-style revolution, and so something had to be done very, very quickly. And Scheidemann, one of the leaders of the SPD, or the Socialist Party, declared a republic. On the 10th of November, Ebert, who becomes president, gets together with one of the major generals there, Gröner, and agree a pact. The army agrees to support the new regime, i.e. the new constitution, in return for reassurances that its independence will be preserved. This in effect makes the army a state within a state. It could effectively do what it wanted. And this was all in return for any attacks on the state, that the army would step in and try and preserve it. A Council of People's Representatives were formed, was formed, and this was an attempt at a form of parliament. And all German Congress of Workers and Soldiers councils meets, and again this seems to be sliding further and further towards what had happened in Russia in November 1917. You begin to see street fighting in Berlin. The USPD, more about them later, resigned from the government, and the KPD is formed mainly as through the USPD plus other left-wing groups. The Spartacists, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, attempt a coup, only to be crushed by the army and the Freikorps. Again, more about them later. Between April and May, the Socialist Republic of in Munich is crushed by, again, regular troops under the Freikorps. So what happens with this split in the left? Well, the split in the left mirrors what was going on in Russia. Basically, up till 1917, the left were basically made up of socialist parties around the world. But with the Russian Revolution, you get a revolutionary wing, which became later on the Communist parties, and the more progressive parliamentary wing, which became the socialist parties. And this is more or less what's happened in Germany as well. So the 42 SPDs broke away from the rest of the party to form the USPD. The remainder become the majority Socialist Party and remain within the government. And eventually you get a divide in November, the November Revolution. MSPD uphold democracy, wanted moderate reforms, and were opposed by a Soviet-style communism. The USPD wanted radical social, economic, political reform, but shied away from full communism. It was deeply divided, and its influence curtailed by factional squabbles. The Spartacists and revolutionary shop stewards campaigned for a socialist republic based on the workers and soldiers' councils, which would follow the same path as in Bolshevik Russia. Here we see a photograph, a very famous photograph, of the proclamation of the Republic on the 9th of the 11th, 1918. Very hastily done, I might add, mainly because nobody really knew what was going on. A crowd had formed outside the Reichstag, which we can see there, the German Parliament, and something had to be done and said very, very quickly. Here we can see the leader of the Bavarian Revolution, Kurt Eisner, and his assassin, 22-year-old Anton Graf von Arx of Valley. The revolution in Bavaria was pretty amazing in many ways, in that it's often seen as a fairly conservative area of Germany, but declared itself a socialist republic in 1917. These are photographs of Freikorps. Freikorps were basically soldiers, ex-soldiers who came back and were being paid to do the fighting, or rather than the regular army, often being many of them were unemployed and were willing to do the fighting even for no pay whatsoever. As it says here, there's a paramilitary organisation of demobilised soldiers and officers. Many soldiers felt discontented from civilian life and joined Freikorps in search of stability provided by a military structure. Remember, many of them had been in the trenches for many, many years. They fought in the Baltics against the Red Army and against the Poles in Silesia, and had helped to put down a number of communist uprisings. However, they were, as we're going to find out later, they were involved in the Kapp Putsch of 1920. More about that, as I say, later. Some Freikorps members committed political assassinations of key people. For example, Rathenau. These were people seen as the November traitors. Again, more about that later. Eventually, some joined the Nazi Party. Well, what were the different parties? Well, I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly, but you can see there you have the German Socialist Democratic Party, or the SPD, the USPD, which eventually becomes the Communist Party, the German Democratic Party, the DDP, which was a sort of left liberal party, the Zentrum, Centre Party, Deutsche Volkspartei, that's the centre-right party. Then you've got the Deutsche National Volksparty, German National People's Party. They were a racist right-wing party. And then you've got a number of smaller parties, including the National Socialist Party of Germany, which eventually became the Nazi Party. So, in 1919, in the fact that a new constitution had to be written with the abdication of the Kaiser, a federal republic is declared. with the states represented in the Reichsrat. In other words, each of the different smaller states would be represented in a second chamber, and direct elections would take place to the Reichstag. The president would be elected every 7 years by direct universal suffrage, and the Reichstag elected by universal suffrage through proportional representation, more about that in the lessons, every 4 years. The Chancellor and Cabinet were appointed by the President, but required parliamentary support to pass legislation, and this established fundamental civil rights: freedom of press, speech and assembly, equality before the law, and the right to economic justice. All of these had not existed before. Well, what happened in 1920? We'd seen that there was an attempted left-wing revolution which had failed. This was an attempted right-wing revolution, mainly because of the disbanding of the Freikorps in the spring of 1920. In response to this, the Erhard Brigade occupied Berlin and installed the right-wing politician Wolfgang Kapp as Chancellor and General von Luttwitz as head of the army. What they basically wanted was a return of the Kaiser. The government fled to Dresden, from where they called on workers and civil servants to resist the putsch. The Reichswehr refused to intervene, but the coup lacked popular support and was brought down by a general strike. The ordinary people basically did their job. There was a great deal of political violence, assassinations, both by the left and right, a number of communist uprisings. You can see there key people, especially members of the government, or November criminals, or what were called the November criminals, people who agreed to the Treaty of Versailles, and also the setting up of the Weimar Republic. These was targeted, and a number of them were assassinated, including Walter Rathenau. Here we can see a quote by Ernst von Salomon, who was a member of the Freikorps, and you can see there's a quote at the end. In that case, the only course open was to eliminate every Erfüllungspolitik, were basically people who accepted the Versailles Treaty. To eliminate in this context is, of course, to kill. What other means was there at our disposal? You can see two members of paramilitary violence, Erzberger and Rathenau. And eventually we see the Munich beer hall putsch of 1923. This was inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922, when Mussolini and his fascist party march on Rome. The government collapses and he becomes part of the government. On the 8th of November, Hitler led the right-wing rulers of Bavaria hostage in an attempt to persuade to join him on a march on Berlin to overthrow the Republic. Initially they agreed, but once free they turned their back on Hitler and brought extra troops into Munich. At a demonstration the next day, Nazis shot a policeman and the police returned fire, dispersing the demonstration. Hitler, Ludendorff and other leaders put on trial for high treason, but received lenient sentences. Major economic crisis had been building up, as I mentioned earlier on, right up until 1923. There was a lack of capital investment, which was made worse by wartime and peacetime economy. The government refused to either raise taxes or cut expenditure, and as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, because of an inability to pay reparations, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr. This led to an inability to raise taxes from the Ruhr, cut off from the supplies of coal that powered German industry and exports. The government's finances collapsed, and we see hyperinflation. You can read about all this yourselves. The major thing is it has a major psychological effect, which increased crime and prostitution, undermined faith in the public, and increased nihilism and materialism. And even to this day, politicians and economists in Germany are very frightened of hyperinflation because of what happened in 1923. The conclusion: German politics was radicalised by the experience of war and defeat, but for the vast majority of Germans were primarily concerned with the material well-being, not political reform. The circumstances of its birth hampered the Weimar Republic. Revolution, counter-revolution, economic crisis, and the bitter legacy of defeat all helped undermine faith in this new democracy. The Weimar Constitution achieved much, for example, a democratic system, welfare state, but did little to solve the deep divisions within German society and left key institutions unreformed. But the Republic weathered the storm, which should indicate that it had more popular support and stronger institutions, and has sometimes